You ever have a day where a stranger decides your whole life is trash and tells you that to your face? That's where this starts. A bright Sunday morning, my mom in her church-dress Bible in her hands and some young landlord stepping into our hallway like he owned the whole block and calling us worthless right in front of the neighbors. Yeah, that happened. For 30 years, my parents paid rent on time, kept the place spotless, raised a kid who couldn't be more proud. And in one breath, a man with a fancy cufflink decided those years meant nothing. If you want to know how a small, stubborn act of dignity turns into something bigger, let me tell you what happened in the Brookside Towers and how an ordinary family's refusal to vanish changed everything. Act 1. The Life. They built. My parents, James and Ruth Monroe, weren't flashy. Dad spent 32 years sorting parcels at the City Mail Depot, retired with a modest pension and hands that still looked like they'd been built for work. Mom taught Sunday school for decades, knew every kid's name, hung on to the same recipes and the same laugh. Their apartment was a museum of quiet love. Framed graduations, a faded clipping announcing someone in the family had made it big, a scratch on the kitchen floor from a table we danced around at Christmas. That place wasn't just where they lived, it was where they kept their vows, their memories, the evidence that their life mattered. Then came the new owner, Oliver Grant. Guy inherited an old building from his dad and saw dollar signs where his father saw tenants. He wanted upscale. He wanted demographics. Words that translate to, get out people who look like you. Grant started small, at first surprise inspections at 7 in the morning, heated arguments about dust on the windowsill, a habitability issue, pinned on a water stain that had been reported years ago and never fixed. He treated my parents like paperwork, not people. He stood in our lobby with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, telling anyone who'd listen that the building needed to be cleaned up. I remember the morning he cornered my mom in the hallway, leaned down like he was making a joke and said, "This building's for respectable folks now, not the kinds who take government handouts." He spat near her shoes like that would make his point. My dad, 71, quiet as a Sunday hymn, didn't flinch. He took Mom's hand and said nothing at first because that's how he had always kept his dignity. Not by answering every insult, but by saving his voice for the moments that mattered. Act 2. The pressure and the turn. When you push someone with no power, you expect silence. You expect them to fold, to leave. Grant counted on that. He filed fake complaints, manufactured noise violations, shut off the water for hours when no one filed anything. He sent an eviction notice that read like a hatchet job: unauthorized occupants, property damage, failure to comply. Words stitched together to look official and final. That paper was meant to end 29 years of steady tenacity in one swipe of a pen. But here's the thing about people who have been overlooked their whole lives. They learn to keep records. My parents had stacks of letters, dates, receipts, photos of the ceiling stain. Everything Grant's office claimed was new had a history. They didn't just keep things because they were obsessive. They knew the world sometimes needs proof to see what it's done. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table, hands shaking, and read that eviction notice aloud. The room smelled like coffee and burnt toast, and she said, "James, what are we going to do?" And for the first time in years, her voice cracked. We called my sister, we talked quietly on the phone, and then my dad did something he barely ever did. He called me. He didn't want to worry me. He said, "Son, don't worry about us the same way a man trims the edges of a lie to keep someone else from feeling the cut." But I heard the tremor. I heard the old man who once carried plywood in the rain finally sounding tired, and I knew this was no longer just paperwork. This was a test. Now, here's the twist Grant didn't see coming. He was messing not just with a quiet couple in Unit 5C, he was messing with the son they raised. I had left home at 19, worked my way through law school, and by the time this started, I was a federal appellate attorney with a quiet practice and a louder conscience. My parents had raised me to see value where others saw nothing. They taught me to stand when it's easier to sit down. So I bought a plane ticket, packed a legal brief, and drove back to the building where my childhood scraped against the linoleum. I didn't come in with guns and cursing, I came with paperwork. Copies of every complaint they'd ever filed, recordings of the water shut-off neighbor statements, photos of repairs they had requested and never received. I walked into Grant's office and laid it out like a table of facts. He laughed at first, a small, nervous sound that wanted to be bigger than his courage. Then he tried the old game intimidation. "You think a lawsuit will scare me?" he asked, voice smooth, like a man who had never been told no. But facts are stubborn. When you have 19 pages of documented lies, 3 affidavits from other elderly tenants who'd been pushed out the same way, and a ledger that shows patterns instead of accidents, lawyers tend to take notice. I didn't threaten him with titles or name-dropping. I showed him the law. I showed him the consequences of crossing a line that used to be invisible because people were too afraid to point to it. He realized he was exposed. Act 3. The Reckoning and the Question. What followed was a slow unmasking. Journalists came. Neighbors came forward. The housing authority opened an investigation. Grant's office scrambled, then cracked. The press called it a landlord scandal, but for us it felt more like the lights coming on in a dark room. Officers served subpoenas. The claims turned into a criminal indictment for falsifying documents and violating fair housing statutes. Weeks later, Grant was escorted out in handcuffs, the very man who spat near my mother's shoes now trying to explain himself to a judge. The building changed hands. Not to another landlord with a spreadsheet for a heart, but to a non-profit that kept rents reasonable and fixed things quickly. Donna Grant's assistant, who'd followed orders out of fear, testified under oath and later accepted a job helping tenants file complaints. A small redemption that meant she wouldn't spend her life hiding what she'd seen. My parents kept their apartment, that little living room with the sag and the sofa where my father always sat reading the paper, and we held a dinner that tasted like victory, even though we knew it wasn't the end. But here's the part I want you to sit with was justice served because my last name sounded official because I had a law degree and a willingness to fight no. The case became a story because my parents refused to disappear quietly. They recorded they asked for help, they kept receipts. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up slowly started talking. One by one, the ledger of abuses grew until it couldn't be ignored. If anything, my presence sped up the enforcement, but it was their work. The notes on the fridge, the phone logs, the church folks who vouched for them, that made the law have teeth. When the dust settled, the settlement included compensation and a mandate for training on fair housing for property managers. There were headlines and interviews, sure, but more than that, there was a small change in our corner of the city. Neighbors smiled again in the lobby. The woman who used to pick her head up when my mother walked by now shook her hand and thanked her. We replaced fear with community. A small revolution maybe, but real. Now, I know some people will say, you got lucky, you had connections. Maybe. But luck doesn't make the receipts. It doesn't make a neighbor get up and testify. It doesn't make a frightened assistant stand up in court and answer for her silence. What this story teaches is the power of refusing to be erased. To say, no, this is wrong and I will not accept it. That's where change starts. So here's what I want you to do. First, if you're a tenant, document. Take pictures, keep letters, write dates. You'd be surprised how honest facts can be when no one is listening. Second, if you see discrimination, don't look away. Record. If you can report it to local authorities, call a legal aid clinic. Third, talk about it. Share this story with someone who might be living quietly under pressure because silence is the thing people with power count on. And finally, tell me in the comments, what do you think is justice, a matter of who you know or a matter of who refuses to be silent? Have you ever seen someone pushed around and wondered whether fighting back was worth it? Drop your story below. Let's argue. Let's heal. Let's build a neighborhood where dignity isn't a luxury. Hit like if this moved you, subscribe. If you want more stories about how ordinary people push against being erased, and share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up does work. Sometimes it starts with a receipt on the fridge, and sometimes it ends with a building that belongs to its neighbors again.